Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me. Welcome back. It's been such a wonderful day, and I'm so happy to be here. I'm joining you this afternoon from the Harvard Writing Center, where I supervise a group of what I feel I should now say are human writing tutors who are right outside my door doing something that I hope they'll always be doing, regardless of where this technology takes us, which is having conversations with students about their ideas and working through the process of figuring out what they think. In addition to directing the Writing Center, I teach first-year writing here at Harvard, and I'm having a very interesting semester right now teaching a new topic-based writing seminar called To What Problem is ChatGPT the Solution? And I will report back. In the meantime, I'm excited to welcome you to the final panel of today's symposium, which fittingly, after all that we've been offered to think about, will focus on what's next, a question I'm sure we'll all be talking about also in breakout rooms later and for many months to come. It's an honor to introduce you to our two keynote speakers today, Katie Conrad and Amba Kok. Katie will be speaking first about the Bill of Rights for Education that she's drafted, which is a blueprint for educators and students in the age of AI. Katie is a professor of English at the University of Kansas. In addition to the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights for Education, she's published articles and book chapters on technology and culture and runs a Substack with the most wonderful name, Pandora's Bot. She is co-director of the AI and Digital Literacy Project in partnership with the National Humanities Center and the Hall Family Foundation. And she's also currently serving as interim director of the Gunn Center for the Study of Science Fiction. After Katie speaks, we'll hear from Amba Kok, who is going to talk about the policy challenges that we face or that lie ahead. Amba is the executive director of the AI Now Institute, where she focuses on a range of issues, including AI regulation, data privacy, competition, network neutrality, and digital copyright. She's worked for a decade across a range of public policy roles within civil society, academic centers, and industry. Prior to AI Now, Amba was global policy advisor at Mozilla, where she helped develop Mozilla's policy positions and supported a multi-pronged campaign for data protection laws in India and Kenya. She's advised the US federal regulator on privacy and competition issues and served as senior advisor on AI at the Federal Trade Commission. Her work is published widely across academic journals and popular outlets and has been featured in Nature, MIT Tech Review, Politico, and many others. Once we've heard from Katie and Amba, we'll open the floor for discussion as we've been doing all day, and I will keep an eye on your questions as things unfold. So Katie, I will turn things over to you.
Thank you. And let me share my screen here. And apologies here. There we go. So thanks to everyone. Thanks to Critical AI, especially for including me in this session. Despite my name on the flyer, all the important work has been done on the Rutgers end. So as I've said online many times, I'm humbled to be part of this group of teachers and scholars and writers who are considering the place of so-called artificial intelligence in education and who've helped form my own thinking on this topic. And some of my comments today will echo and amplify some of the things we've touched on already. I can't see the chat from where I am, so if anybody has a problem with sound, please just tell me. If you're just joining us now, I hope you'll be able to go back and watch the rest of the day's sessions and that you'll be able to come back for breakouts after this session. So as Jane said, I've been asked to talk about the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights for Education, which was published on the Critical AI blog at the end of the summer, and to share a few reflections I have on it that might generate some practical discussion either during this session or during our breakouts after this panel. And the TLDR is that the title of this session, What's Next, is a question that I think we all need to be able to be at the table to answer. And I know some of you have read the Bill of Rights already and others haven't, so I hope there's something for both groups in my remarks today. And I also wanted to mention that I chose this PowerPoint template on purpose because it seems funny to me as a letterpress printmaker to use PowerPoint with embedded generative AI design with a letterpress aesthetic. So consider it a kind of ironic shout out to Bryant Merchant's new book. So to start with a moment with what's past instead of what's next, I wrote this piece after I started to articulate to myself what I thought my responsibility was as an educator who did not necessarily ask for AI. So I recognized, like so many of us did at the end of the semester last fall, that ChatGPT and other technologies were likely to impact student work. I've shown and talked to students about chatbots and AI several times over the last decade as part of reflections on technologically mediated knowledge. But of course, ChatGPT is a lot different than ELIZA or Kooky AI. And I did a lot of experimenting with and probing of ChatGPT in particular, as well as DALL-E and other image generation software last fall. And like several people here, I started to think and talk with other teachers about generative AI as well throughout the winter and in the spring to build my own literacy. And so that led to the half-day summit that Jane mentioned on AI and digital literacy and humanities education. And one of the things I learned is that our fellow high school and college educators, 2- and 4-year college educators, were reporting that they were operating with either no policies or with hastily created stopgaps. And there was a desire to, among many, to create some kind of informed policy structure, either at the classroom level or the institutional one, or both. I struggled to think about how we might, as educators, approach policies about AI in a way that wasn't just reactive. So the conversations in the spring felt very reactive to me, not surprisingly. We were reacting, but our responses were amplified and twisted by exaggerated media representations of those responses. So I started by trying out a few ideas on social media. I got responses, including from some folks who are here today, and I eventually came to the idea of a Bill of Rights. One of my models was the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights from the U.S. Office of Science and Technology. And the basic tenets are on the screen right now. I was inspired by it as an initial framework. I was so inspired by it that I was frustrated by all of the caveats, as well as the fact that models and systems that did not clearly meet those principles were already making their way into government use. And I won't linger on this aspect of the Bill of Rights because I know AMBO will be speaking to policy and regulation shortly. But I did think have you not seen anything up to this point? Let's see.
We have seen your slides, Katie, but not you.
Oh, okay.
But we see your
That's
slides.
fine. All right, great. So one of my models, anyway, so I thought the Bill of Rights was an excellent starting point for an approach based on principles and protections. So this on the screen is the minimalist version of the educator's rights section of the piece. For those with low or no vision or just listening while you're making a sandwich or a cup of coffee, the majority of the text on my slides can be accessed through the published version of the Bill of Rights on the Critical AI blog, and the rest of the notes on slides will be spoken aloud. So my hope, as I've said elsewhere, is that the Bill of Rights could serve as a starting point for policies. For educators, I delineated rights for input into purchasing and implementation of automated and generative systems, input on policies concerning AI and other automated systems, professional development support, pedagogical autonomy, and of course, general protection of legal rights. So I want to break down some of these rights and some thoughts I and others have both before and since the publication of this document. The first is the question of purchasing and implementation of AI and related systems. One of the critiques, if it can actually be seen as a critique of this Bill of Rights, has been from colleagues saying, but educators don't have input into ed tech purchasing decisions as it is. While that might be expected in some educational institutions, it seems to me that at least at institutions with a shared governance structure for faculty, for instance, where faculty are expected to have oversight of curriculum, why don't we have this sort of input? This is just one example. I think one of the lessons of the current moment is that the introduction of the current unregulated generative AI models into the educational environment has really brought longstanding issues in education into sharper focus. Technology is not neutral. We've heard that multiple times today. Educational technology is not neutral. And while there may be some affordances of certain technologies, including AI, that might be able to help educators need to be at the table when decisions to buy into them, literally and figuratively, are made. And that's true no matter what technology we're talking about. So I'll come back to the issue of policy when I get to student rights. And at the end, I'll share a Padlet with some links to the resources I mentioned here, by the way. So to continue with educator rights, the right to institutional support for professional development seemed to be important as well, especially given the many pivots we've had to make over the last few years, the pandemic being the most obvious one. This symposium today, as Lauren and I talked about it at the beginning, was really intended to fill some of those gaps that some of us might be experiencing, but schools need to provide that support as well. It's really in their best interests and the best interests of our students to support and incentivize this training. Having done some introductory sessions for staff and faculty at KU, where in some cases people were sitting on the floor because the room was so full, I can say there's a will and an interest. The pre-registration for today is another indication, but there are a lot of competing calls on educators' times. So I think it needs to be incentivized, and I'd really love to hear from all of you about what you think the best way to do that might be. Administrators also need to take opportunities to gain that literacy, but it can't be a one and done sort of situation, as our conversations today, I think, have suggested. So moving to the next right here, autonomy. As I said, one of the frustrations I've heard amongst teachers is around policy, and that goes from frustration about the lack of policy to frustration about outright bans on AI use from students and teachers. And I'm hearing that mostly from K-12. Ultimately, and this may seem obvious, but it's important that teachers be allowed to teach. That means letting us make decisions about how we approach, teach about, and use technologies in our classrooms. And given how broad and sloppy the term AI is, it's difficult to capture all instantiations of it with any kind of institutional policy. And again, I'll come back to that in a minute, but I think it's important to note that we still have a responsibility to be intentional and respect student rights as we employ AI. One way to ensure student rights are respected is to teach about AI without necessarily requiring its use, or by carefully curating particular opportunities for its use. One of the things that seems important to emphasize here, and as I state in the preamble, is that the systems we have right now were not created with an eye to education. Educational applications were an afterthought, and I'm echoing what others in this Zoom room have said earlier today. The AI models we have are also not the only models we'll ever have. And I don't mean improving the models we have now. I mean new models that might be different or ethically trained. And I really do think there's an opportunity for educators to be partners in developing ethical, purpose-built systems with educational user interfaces. So the critiques I have are the systems we have now, and I'm sure we'll speak to those to some degree as well. But even as we protect educators' right to make informed choices, I still believe we have a responsibility to be transparent about the costs and harms, as well as the opportunities the current systems entail. So to move to the students' right, rights. These are what I really want to focus on right now, honestly. The student rights identified here are to instructor guidance around AI, safe consultation about whether and how AI can be used, data privacy and creative control, the right to appeal, the right to be given notice if AI is being used for assessment, and of course, overall legal protections. So I want to talk a bit, as I said, about policies for AI use. There's some great guidance circulating right now. Toronto, Rutgers, of course, Harvard's Meta Lab, which was a student-generated policy suggestions. These are all policies that I think are current. Lance Eaton has been curating policy ideas since the spring. I'm not going to drill down into policy suggestions right now. I think we can probably talk about that in the Q&A if people want to, but I just want to mention a few things here. I've talked to students about instructors' policy statements this semester. In one class, I actually had them bring in the policies that their classes had, and many of them, and I'm talking not just about my students in that class, but the ones who've received any kind of policy syllabus or conversation, it is often consisted of some form of don't use AI. Occasionally it's been don't use AI and I'll know if you do. And in other cases, you can use it, it's fine, right? There are a lot of reasons to limit or ban the use of generative AI, and I do it myself. That really isn't the question that I want to draw our attention to. The point I want to make is that saying no AI isn't clear enough or enforceable, or even in some cases what the instructor intends. The students who created the proposed Harvard policies, for instance, recommended that instructors distinguish between categories of tools, for instance, large language models, and specific tools, for instance, Midjourney or ChatGPT or whatever. And you can't use those interchangeably, they're different. So taking care with terms is really important to ensure that students have as fair and equal a playing field as possible. There's not a single agreed upon way to cite generative AI tool use. And as Anna noted earlier today, there's a difference between an acknowledgement of tool use and acknowledgement or citation as an author. So that's important to stress. If you do allow it, you should also offer guidelines for how and when to cite their usage. And I share here on the slide, model, date, prompt, the output, the stage of the project in which they used it. Those are all things that you might ask students to specify and give them guidance about how to do that. The final point here under guidance is that many instructors right now, K-12 through grad school, don't have a policy. And in my informal survey of students, they don't agree on whether no policy means that they can use AI or that they shouldn't. And that creates an equity concern, right? And more than one commenter in earlier sessions has sort of brought that up. Again, this isn't a new issue in some ways. There are a range of forms of help that students are unclear about whether they can use in our classes. AI just brings this ambiguity into focus. So the glass half full part of the talk is that a lot of issues we've had in education are being brought into sharper focus with AI. Without guidance, though, we create fairness and equity issues because the baseline assumptions amongst our students aren't even the same, much less what we're telling them. And the second note at the bottom of the slide here on consultation seemed obvious to me at first, that you would have a right to consult and ask about AI use. But this is one thing I was shocked about, so I wanted to stress it today. Conversations with students from the spring onward to this week have me more concerned. It's important. I think we need to make it make it clear to students and to make it clear to instructors that asking about whether or not AI can be used is not suspicious. many students do not feel empowered to ask for clarification. And students who are more vulnerable, for whatever reason, whether they're non-native speakers or students with scholarships, they may feel that asking about AI use makes them suspicious. We need to normalize asking. We need to encourage asking. We need to make it safe for students to ask, which may mean making explicit at a policy level something that many of us as instructors would take for granted. So as we move to privacy and creative control, we've had some discussion of this already today. I think it's just important here to note that even though students may be giving up their data right and left, and I've certainly heard that from some instructors, we can't protect their data, they don't protect their own data, but that's not our choice to make for them, right? A few notes here. Entering student information into an automated system may be a FERPA violation. It's possible for systems to spit data back out in an identifiable way in a future query, but it actually doesn't matter whether or not it does. The important thing is that the violation is in putting the data into the system, not in getting it back out. So that's important. Student creative control over their work has been a vexed issue since Turnitin, as I say here. Again, this is not a new issue. It's just an issue that the introduction of AI brings back into focus for us. And then finally, excitement about improvements in accessibility, and we talked a little bit about that earlier today. I too share that excitement about the possibilities, but I think it's important to remember that accessibility options should be vetted to ensure that they maintain student privacy and creative control. Students with disabilities or who use these systems, accessibility systems, have that right just as much as anyone else. We have seen a lot of access washing by big tech using what seems to be an accessibility thing, but actually the main usage of it is something else, like targeting for weapons, for instance. So it's important to keep that in mind. Now, I just want to linger on this for a minute as I come to a conclusion here. When faculty say they want policy, they often mean that they want to catch all. That means they can punish those for who use AI in an unauthorized way, but policy doesn't necessarily solve that issue. So just to stress what many of you know, detection systems are not reliable. They produce both false negatives and false positives, and the latter is what I'm most concerned about. We have to be sure that when we talk about policy, we enforce it equitably and avoid the biases in enforcement that are also true of the biases in the systems. But ultimately, I think the issue isn't punishing offenders. It's rethinking how we do the work of education and working from educational goals first to ensure students are able to meet them with the assignments that we give them. AI has shifted that. These are the conversations many educators have been having, including many of the folks here today, and I hope we'll continue it in breakouts in a more granular way. But finally, and when it comes to AI detection, it's important to remember that AI detection software is AI. So it brings us to the next right of noticed, that you should be noticed, or you should be given notice if an AI system is being used to grade. This is not only an AI issue. Again, automated grading has been used for a long time. AI just brings the question of automation back into sharper focus. So ultimately, just in closing then, my goal in creating this document wasn't to be the final word on policy issues, but rather to give teachers and students a foundation to build on and for conversations about what we value in education. So I look forward to our conversations here and in breakouts later. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Katie. for the wonderful talk. And I've been following in the chat, which you'll want to catch up on. All sorts of interesting comments are already coming up. So we will hold questions until after we hear from Amba. But if you should feel free, all of you, to be thinking about your questions. We will have time for questions. And I will turn things over to Amba now.
Thank you so much, Jane, and thanks, Katie. That was a really fascinating talk. Federal and more general AI policy level, we're quite disconnected from some of these sectoral developments, probably to kind of our own detriment as policy researchers. So I'm gonna, just to introduce myself. Again, I'm Amba Kak. I'm very honored to be here amongst this community of critical educators. I've done public policy work throughout my career. And, one way I like to describe it, because sometimes it does need that explanation, is that policy work at its best, or I would say is kind of not about what the law or regulation is necessarily today, but kind of, or not just about that, but also about what it should be, and kind of advocating for the future we want, often within traditional political levers of influence like legislation or regulation. So kind of the what's next for the title of the session, is not inevitable. And so much of the work that we, and I speak in a kind of broad collective here of advocates and policy professionals that are working kind of critically to address challenges emanating from so-called AI. So much of that work is really about reasserting that lack of inevitability in an environment where we're kind of operating under a serious democratic deficit in so many ways. So everything is, everything is a story, as this audience knows probably better than I do. And in the policy world, which is where I move kind of more day to day, there's a sense that somehow it isn't, that it's this more kind of technocratic expert treatment of the world. But of course it's not. And of course it's not immune to the stories that are being told about AI, whether that's in dining tables or kind of in TV or in mainstream media. So there've always been these kind of stories that shape the limits of what is possible in the regulatory sphere, like what there's appetite to do and in what direction. But the stories kind of specifically circulating in the AI policy domain have always taken on this kind of life of their own, precisely because the term artificial intelligence has such kind of shifting contours, right? So it makes it especially malleable to like strategic pivots from industry and kind of other actors that are invested in a kind of linear advancement or proliferation of these technologies. So as we know it today, and again, I'm forgive me if any of this is repetitive, because I know we've had a long day, but kind of, I would say, like, as a table setting point, artificial intelligence today could like roughly refer to the use of probabilistic and statistical techniques that look for patterns in very large data sets, and which are processed using a tremendous amount of computing power. And this is true both of kind of extant uses of AI and of generative AI, which has become the kind of current focus of public and policy discourse. But I wanted to kind of spend a little time on the term AI itself in the policy domain, because we might call it a marketing term, but it is one that moves, it's moving the policy conversation. It attracts media attention. It attracts and moves financial capital, philanthropic capital. And so kind of, I feel like it's a term that we kind of always have to leverage strategically, even if we're cynical about what it even means and kind of why, right? So one way in which we've approached this is like, how do we unmask AI to, or use that kind of space that's been given to then kind of subvert and say, actually, what we really want to talk about is this political or economic agenda. So some examples from the pre-ChatGPT era, just to remind ourselves that the fight around AI technologies is much, much longer. One example which we love to give is that the state of Michigan replaced its unemployment benefit fraud detection system, which kind of human operated system, with an automated system. It was later found through a kind of very lengthy legal challenge that this system inaccurately labeled people as inaccurately labeled them as fraudulently seeking benefits 93% of the time. So it was mostly always inaccurate. By the time this was actually proven, it had already led to several bankruptcies and multiple suicides. Now, we reflected with the legal aid attorneys and the frontline activists involved in this case that, like, was this a system? Was this a case of AI errors, or was it just a system working as it was intended, given that there had been a change of government? So maybe this was actually about austerity politics and not about AI. Facial recognition in housing complexes in Brooklyn, again, when we analyzed that particular case, it seemed to be that it was about exclusionary housing policies and creeping gentrification, not just kind of AI in kind of its narrow sense. Similarly, with worker surveillance and warehousing, or kind of the use of worker surveillance in the warehouse being about kind of chipping away at worker autonomy and organizing. So, and I think this group can tell me better what are the various ways in which kind of AI education applications might be masking underlying political and economic currents and kind of marginalizing certain kinds of thought and particularly kind of critical disciplines. Now, all of this long story to say that for us, the shift in the policy space became to constantly emphasize that we didn't want laws and regulation using the word AI. We wanted the term automated decision systems. And it might seem like semantics, but really it was about saying that these are not, we want to move away from the idea of intelligence, and we want to redirect attention to the fact, focus not on these arbitrary technical thresholds, which is what a lot of the legislation had at the time, but it's like, is a spreadsheet, is it all of those kinds of questions, and instead say, let's look at where automated logics are replacing or aiding human decision making. How are they kind of deciding resource allocation, curating social interactions, influencing power relations, like focusing on what these automated decision systems do rather than arbitrary technical thresholds. And I would say to a large degree, we've been fairly successful in making this argument because of the fact that it became the term of choice in legislation, not just in the United States, but also in the EU and other places. I mean, not entirely, but we did see a kind of heavy policy uptick, also Canada. So all of that was kind of maybe the last 5 years, but like, let's zoom into the last several weeks. And we at AI Now, along with several others, have been meeting with lawmakers and other kind of politically and influential institutions and regulators in the US and abroad. And invariably in those rooms, much to our own, I guess, frustration, we're talking about what Brian in the previous session referred to as apocalyptic marketing, right? So we are having to answer questions or deflect questions about sentience, about machines turning human beings, about the possibility of biological weapons being made easier by the use of LLMs. All the jobs will be replaced, that kind of thing, right? And I'm thinking to myself, like, wait, how did we get here, right? We started the year with ChatGPT, and we had multiple accounts of security failures, like concerns about plagiarisms, concerns we had created the world's most effective spam generator, the kind of misinformation, and more broadly put the kind of like information rupture that this potentially, posed with a generation of like synthetic content, kind of the strikes in the creative industry, so on and so forth. And yet in these power corridors that we're in and in the policy conversation in DC over the last 6 weeks, all of that has taken a backseat in favor of so-called frontier AI. Where did that term come from? That term frontier AI, which is now the subject of the White House commitments and the UK government's upcoming AI Safety Summit, actually came from a paper written by, or I think it was written by or published by OpenAI and other collaborators, that defines frontier AI as artificial intelligence models that are generally more powerful than the current industry frontier, which is such a move, not just because who decides what is more powerful, but because it means that any regulatory effort that uses the term frontier AI isn't actually applying to anything that is on the market today, which honestly is like, should be really a scandal. The fact that we were even celebrating the White House commitments as self-regulation rather than questioning the fact that they are looking to the future and completely sidestepping what is currently on the market, whether that's ChatGPT or any of these other applications that are being fine-tuned in particular sectoral applications, is truly problematic and also very, very strategic and kind of canny policy and strategic thinking on the part of these companies. So like I said, we're also seeing kind of legislation that has been evolving, not going very far, but kind of evolving over the last 5 years, also being marginalized. We focus more on the federal level. So, there's a range of bills, some of which have been able to kind of reemerge with kind of bipartisan support, or like with a bipartisan member behind it, and others which have come back without that. And all of like kind of across the board, we're seeing that those are less the topic of conversation, right? So Senator Schumer, for example, held an AI forgetting the name, Insight Forum recently. And many have criticized the fact that there were mostly tech CEOs and these kind of tech executives or tech affiliated voices in the room, and a very small minority of civil society and civil rights voices in that room. But more importantly, the kind of public relations comments that came out of that room was Senator Schumer and his staffers talking about how we're really at the start of gathering information. We're not sure we want to act too quickly, but we want to learn more and we want to do more of these sessions. And when you hear that in policy speak, what does that mean? That means we're not going to act anytime soon. We've gone to this position where it's almost like we're at the start of something rather than the culmination of 5 years of understanding how these systems work, their harms, and how to address them, and kind of erasing all of that in place of a supposed regulatory blank slate. This at a time when, we do have other promising efforts like the Senator Blumenthal and Senator Hawley's framework, which was in kind of broad terms, not yet in bill form, not yet public in bill form, that took kind of much more stronger stances and says, like, we have what we need pre-deployment testing and validation. But those efforts seem to, at least in this current moment, have taken a little bit of a backseat. And so I'm sort of just sharing what the present looks like from our vantage, right? What this narrative, and I would say this narrative on existential risk is very closely tied to the broader national security narrative. So that works at 2 levels as well. The first level is, let's say this claim that LLMs make the creation, can kind of help teach people how to make toxic molecules and biological weapons, which could then be accessed by adversaries and become a national security threat. That's one version of the argument with, I would say, pretty scant empirical base at the moment, or evidentiary basis. And the other version of the argument, which has again been building for the last 5 years, is this kind of combination or coming together of both the technology industry and the national security establishment to argue that the US needs to win at AI. Winning at AI at all costs is important because otherwise China will win at AI. And if China wins at AI, then we have authoritarian AI versus democratic AI. But the kind of irony, the sad irony of all of this is that argument is typically leveraged, and we've kind of tracked this at AI Now. It has been repeatedly leveraged to really argue against any kind of accountability legislation, antitrust intervention, privacy law, and accountability measures, all of those things that would arguably make the claim of democratic AI a meaningful one to begin with. So that's a really kind of troubling, but again, not a new phenomenon, but we're seeing the kind of security rationale really prop up. Really crop up again. Sorry, I'm just looking at the chat for a second and seeing if there were comments, but that was a bit distracting. Anyway, so like I was saying, I think just, is a feature of both the national security and this existential risk paradigm, immunity for current uses, functioning to promote a very narrow section of the tech industry as the experts on AI. And again, this is from older AI discussions as well that I mentioned at the start, right? If the issue, as you understand it, is about how to mathematically fix bias, then sure, the experts will be the technical people in the room. But if you recognize that really some of these systems are biased because they are being deployed in communities and in contexts which are structurally discriminatory, then you realize that the question is less about the technology at all and really about racist policing, gentrification, austerity, and you have a very different list of who you might count as expert for that conversation. And so what happens again with this generative AI moment is if you frame it as an alignment problem rather than a conversation about accountability, if you frame it as a kind of question of these like future kind of complex artificial general intelligence kind of risks, then you're going to have those people in the room that have been invested in these narratives, invested in these kind of corners of the debate, and importantly are invested in technical solutions, whether that's so-called kind of cybersecurity red teaming, or it's this like solving the alignment problem, or kind of technical, again, bias fixes and all of that stuff. And that would explain why the rooms look the way they do. But I would say kind of finally, what these narratives are also doing is they are distracting from what to me is still the thing that kind of keeps me up at night with this moment we're in, which is that it is promoting a consolidation of such tremendous and kind of assuming like legitimizing a consolidation of power in the tech industry, and within it in a handful of companies, and within those companies in a handful of individuals, that feels really untenable for the future of democracy itself, right? Because what we're essentially saying, as we accept that whether that's in the creative industries, in education, or anywhere else, we're really accepting the fact that these are models which at the end of the day, and these are kind of forms of technology at the end of the day, which only very few firms in the world currently have the ability to train and run large models at scale on. And any innovation and product development that is taking places at the edges through kind of fine-tuning these models are essentially building on top of what these large firms have already built because of the kind of heavy computational infrastructure and other kind of related data and other input costs that are related to that are required to create this AI to begin with. So I think that question of kind of who benefits at a kind of macro scale from the inevitability of AI narrative, from the narrative that this will become the social and kind of economic fabric of our lives, and that it is currently controlled by a few companies, which in policy terms you could argue is a question of competition. It's an anti-monopoly question. There are lots of ways in which you can frame it, and also lots of ways in which you can, I think, get at it. And I'll come to that in a second. But that's just to say that I think that particular question is a great example of the kind of issue that will never be raised at kind of Senator Schumer's Insight Forum. It is very unlikely to be raised by all of the tech executives that are today saying they are pro-AI regulation. That is not the kind of question that they want to contend with, because I think for kind of obvious reasons, right? So I think just, can someone tell me how we're doing on time, and then I can just decide how to wrap up the last...
I think we're good for, 4 or 5 more minutes.
Great. Okay. So
And then
I'll
we'll
end
take
by saying,
questions.
I'll end by just saying kind of like what I think we should be, like, where should we be kind of redirecting policy energy instead? Because there's always like, I think even what I've just said can feel like kind of a disempowering state of affairs. The first is obviously what we've been saying is kind of this idea of pre-deployment testing and validation, but also kind of pre-deployment scrutiny of not just like how these general purpose or base models are built, but also where they are used and sectoral applications. You really don't want kind of a regulatory, like what we really, don't have is a regulatory regime that actually protects us from these systems that are being rolled out into wide commercial use with very little testing or validation, right? And already these systems are being used in cars, in schools, in workplaces. One worrying example is MedPalm 2, which is kind of what Google's LLM that it's currently testing in several hospitals, including Mayo Clinic. And it's kind of designed to aid doctors, especially those that are working in kind of under-resourced healthcare systems, by providing answers to medical questions. So while some of the information was published by Google in an article in Nature, like most key data details, like with other LLMs, are missing, like what data it was used to train on, where does that data come from, like what proprietary data sets is Google leveraging, all of that stuff. But also that Google's own published research says that MedPalm, on MedPalm, it suggests that clinicians that were evaluating the system found that there was kind of inappropriate and incorrect content of great clinical significance. And many actually rated MedPalm's answers as likely to contribute to death or severe harm. And this is the sort of kicker, a senior research director at Google told the Wall Street Journal that he doesn't think this technology is at a place where he would want it in his family's healthcare journey, which to me kind of says it all, right? Like these systems, even by their own account, and like Sam Altman said something very similar about ChatGPT, are really like in no shape or form ready to be out in the world with the kind of diffused impacts that they're having. So that's one, and we're kind of pushing, I can get into the wonky details for whoever's interested, for these kind of pre-deployment testing requirements in legislation. The second is concentration of power, kind of who benefits, and a kind of competition regime that really scrutinizes the choke points at every layer of the AI supply chain, whether that's compute, whether that's cloud, whether that's data, whether that's the model stage and the final application stage, and the way in which tech companies are essentially leveraging to consolidate power across, up and down this supply chain, particularly big tech companies that are dominant at the cloud layer. And finally, kind of red lines, right? Reasserting democratic control, applying laws on the books that do apply already. So ChatGPT did not emerge in a regulatory vacuum. There is no blank slate. Apart from all the legislation in waiting, we actually already have a basis for taking action. The FTC, already sent a shot across the board in a recent article where they pointed to the many ways in which the agency could actually step in to regulate generative AI using core consumer protection authorities. They can ask kind of are these tools enabling fraud under our definition? If they are, irrespective of the company's like intention, could they be violating the FTC's prohibition on unfair business practices and on businesses deceiving users, so deception? Will they, this is like the legal term, substantially injure consumers in a way that they cannot reasonably avoid? And, are companies actually even able to substantiate the claims that they've made to mitigate risks? And all of these questions, like what the companies are doing today, might not actually hold up against current FTC rules. The second front is obviously data privacy law. The US doesn't have a federal data privacy law, but in the EU, the GDPR has already been used to haul up these companies, including OpenAI, for their data practices and their kind of lack of compliance with existing procedure. Competition policy, I just mentioned, kind of stricter review, both kind of merger review and kind of a stricter scrutiny of these potential anti-competitive practices up and down the AI supply chain. The blueprint and AI Bill of Rights is a great example, the way in which that could be seeded into legislative efforts as it is already being done. So yeah, I will conclude by saying that kind of power will always be attracted to power, where in a moment where the kind of shininess of the new toy or the supposedly novel toy and the promise of this kind of artificial general intelligence narrative is sweeping through our political institutions. And the counter narratives become more relevant than ever. We have tools at our disposal. We're not starting from a blank slate. What Brian was talking about earlier, the WGA victories are like a very perfect and contemporary example of what it looks like to reclaim that narrative, red lines not as an afterthought, but at the start to decide kind of how and where those impacted, that those impacted directly should be the ones deciding whether and how this tech is deployed and on what terms. I'll close there.
Thank you so much. I can just tell by how lively the chat got that there's much more to discuss. I'll just say that from listening to both of you, it seems like what we're coming away with in terms of a sort of synthesis from what for some of us is very close to home, which is what Katie was talking about, which is how we're going to deal with all of this within our educational institutions. And then in the broader picture that Amba has given us, is this idea that I think was coming through in both talks, that what's going to happen is not inevitable, but it's very difficult to quite see how we're going to carve our path to whatever future we end up with. I wanted to, there's questions for both speakers, but while we're with Amba, I wanted to just ask you two that have come up that I think are related to each other. One question that came up in the chat was an interesting question about your thoughts on the open source side of large language models and how that factors into everything. And then somewhat related was a question of what do you think about the role of big tech companies' approach to public governance of AI? What could a more meaningful approach to public participation look like? So I guess we have sort of two related but separate questions there.
Thank you so much. Let me start with the open source question, and then I might ask you to repeat the second question because just so it's fresh. So the open source debate right now on AI policy, there's many ways in which it's cropping up. So I'll kind of lay that out for those that aren't familiar. On the one hand, what we're hearing is that actually we're hearing this in the existential context of existential risk and national security risks, which is that you have these models which are open source, and kind of the assumption there is that they are freely available to adversaries, and they are capable of all of these potentially terrible things. For example, there's a kind of anecdote that's floating around, and I think originated with one of these AI companies, Anthropic, which is like, what if you asked like the open source meta model Llama how to construct a bioweapon, and it told you, and kind of what does that mean for the kind of Pandora's box or that we are opening up, and that we can't that we want to be really careful about that, and therefore move to closed source. So there's that kind of like fear mongering on the one side. And on the other extreme, there's a kind of harking back to the kind of 1990s understanding of open source as this like tool for democratization, where everybody in a garage can kind of build their own technology. And actually open source is this amazing thing that will challenge the power of big tech, and kind of 1,000 flowers will bloom, and we can all participate in this AI economy. And both of these perspectives are actually dangerous, flawed, and inaccurate for different reasons. So on the one hand, I think the debate on kind of open source being scary and therefore everything needing to be proprietary is misplaced, because really what it's trying to do is move the needle away. It's being used to say that transparency is itself a risk, and that is problematic for many reasons, not just because simply open sourcing a model does not make it necessarily easier to reach any of those dangerous endpoints for a range of reasons, because it's also there's a lot of technical questions there on what would actually be open and what somebody would need to be able to do what these proponents are saying it would do, and whether that would be possible even without that access. But kind of more importantly, that arguably, and we keep saying this in the national securities context, more scrutiny, resilience, and kind of robust testing of these algorithms, whether that's by the public, by the research community, or by regulators, is only going to make these models more resilient. That is the whole ethos behind kind of open sourcing, not just of these models, but in general. And so it's being used in a kind of pernicious way to argue against accountability at a time when we need it the most. But on the other hand, I think it would be a real disservice to confuse open source and also kind of open branding in general, as OpenAI has done, with a kind of decentralized AI ecosystem for the reasons I mentioned in my talk. Because the question we need to ask is that there's an AI supply chain. By focusing just on that final model, we're losing sight of the fact that most parts of the supply chain are still very much closed and concentrated by a few companies. So NVIDIA, for example, as we discussed earlier, is arguably the choke point on chip design and kind of compute for that reason. Related companies, there's a Dutch company, ASML, that on the manufacturing side is the only company that can do it for the chips that are needed for these AI technologies. So you have like, ASML, there's obviously TSMC in Taiwan, which is also being talked about as a kind of national security issue. So on the compute side, you have a very concentrated ecosystem. And I would say on the cloud side, you also have a handful of 3 players, all of which are otherwise very dominant tech platforms that are also concentrating the market. And so none of that changes, right? And then if we focus on these like so-called startups, whether that's OpenAI or Anthropic, it's no surprise that they all have large amounts of funding as well as strategic partnerships with these very same cloud companies, because it is simply unaffordable to be able to build and maintain systems like this because of the compute cost without these partnerships. That's a very long-winded way of saying that anytime someone brings up the question of open source AI, I think first we question whether they're pushing back on accountability, using the kind of bogeyman of these existential risk scenarios. But the second thing we want to do is we want to make sure that they're not pushing back against that they're not kind of using it as a way to describe the potential decentralized nature of the ecosystem, because that would be a disservice to I would say, the main reality we are contending today, which is an even more consolidated tech ecosystem. Sorry, that was very long.
Very helpful. Thank you. So this other question that I had initially given, maybe I'll just read it because I want to make sure that I don't mischaracterize it. What do you think about the role of big tech companies' approach to, quote, public governance of AI? What could a more meaningful approach to public participation look like? And what is the role of standard bodies?
Okay, there's a lot of parts to that question. I think on public governance of AI and companies' role, like we're at such a kind of low point in that discussion right now, because of course industry must be, or like should be, a stakeholder. But what we're seeing right now, just to put it plainly, is a complete industry capture of the governance conversation. That is made apparent by the fact that the UK AI Summit is going to be kind of headlined by tech CEOs. It is made evident by the fact that in Senator Schumer's AI Summit, the main people that are kind of holding forth on what we should do about the problems that arguably their companies will create or have created are the tech company CEOs themselves. We're at this moment where the kind of, it shouldn't be a zero-sum game, but all of the air in the room is currently being absorbed by the tech industry itself. They're also moving quickly at a kind of global governance level. There are currently negotiations at the G7, the OECD, there's the Hiroshima process. There's a kind of global governance conversation on what to do about AI, which will also come to a head at the UK's AI Safety Summit. And again, the signals are not looking promising. So I guess I would answer that question first by saying I'm kind of less interested in what the industry approach is, and more to say that I think that they've kind of, there's a kind of saturation of the policy conversation by only their perspectives at the moment, all of which are in fairly high level terms, like I mentioned, focused on frontier AI, and focused on kind of regulation at this very meta high level, and rarely ever on kind of enforcing laws that exist, and also kind of contending with material harms of the kinds that we raised, whether that's on the kind of IP and copyright side, or the kind of labor implications and workforce implications, or on the kind of competition and consolidation questions. So maybe I'll pause at that. And on standard setting organizations, I think just my one quick note there is that is usually a very problematic place, and even more problematic place for policy to happen, because of the fact that civil society and outside voices are very under-resourced to participate in those processes. They depend on your ability to pay for flights to fly all over the world many times a year in order to build these standards. The people that end up doing that are usually, as a rule, I would say, actually, not usually, those kind of well-resourced tech industry companies. And even within that, I would say very few dominate the conversation. And so I'm not like, I would push back against any effort to kind of stymie policy regulation to happen at technical standard setting organizations, apart from the fact that the kind of safety frame that they will typically use is very, very narrow.
Thank you so much. We'll give you a small break now. Amba's been working very hard for the past hour. So switching gears, I'm trying to think of a good segue from talking about government regulation to moving back to university regulation. But Katie, Anna Mills had asked a question in the Q&A about what you think of apps that are geared for education that track the writing process as a step toward accountability. So rather than looking at detectors to figure out what's going on, is there another way? And I'm sure it would be interesting to hear about that. But just to give everyone else a little bit of context, another thing that Anna pointed out there is this question of how do we design for learning when we don't know what is coming from the students and what is coming from the chatbot.
Thanks, Jane. The best transition I can make is that, one of my problems right now with EdTech and AI applications, some of which are really interesting, is that they're all, to go back to this idea of who's taking all the air in the room, they are primarily API keys that are linked to these big foundation models. And I think Amba's made very clear that foundation models is a way to move regulatory attention away, like we're not talking about foundation models, we have to worry about frontier models. But I think it's important to recognize that Google and other plugins, they're all implicated. So that's one sort of cynical answer, I suppose, Anna. I do like the idea of those ideas of tracking the writing process, but and I know you and I have talked about this sort of online and social media, but one of the things that frustrates me is that Google made a choice to not have their version histories indicate LLM production, right? That's a strategic choice, to go back to the idea that Amba was saying about Google's canniness, right? Like this is a deliberate choice, because in order to they don't want that to be visible, right? And this goes back to that question to me, of whose interests are being served by any given tech. And I think I agree with you. I mean, it's very difficult to get the kind of transparency that we want. And their big tech doesn't seem to see that as in their interest. And that's where it's frustrating just on the ground level, on the granular level, to try to figure out how to work with these technologies in a productive way. So because I agree, doing all writing in class isn't tenable. I mean, I teach an online class, that makes it very difficult. We can talk in breakout sessions or hear about other strategies for getting that process visible, but I don't know that we can trust the current technologies to do that because the interest isn't there, right? I was struck by Luke's question earlier in the chat, that this idea of not having input into EdTech isn't new either, and he was asking, what can we learn from the past? And I think what we can learn from the past is that those processes of purchasing or buying in have been made less and less visible. So again, I don't mean to be cynical. I sometimes joke that I'm a technophilic Luddite. I've been an early adopter, and I think it's as Nigel points out in the chat there, implementation of AI is a choice. It's not an inevitability, and I think that's really important as educators as well. And that's part of critical AI literacy.
Lauren, were you going to jump in?
Yeah. So I actually wonder, so this may be diluted, but many of my ideas are, I actually wonder if education isn't a really good domain, particularly higher education, but also K through 12 and libraries for the kinds of, I don't want to say small, attainable policy wins like that which the Writers Guild was able to do in their workplace for policy experts to be focusing on, because it's, another potential one is the healthcare domain, but I know less about it. But what I can say as someone who's, deep within critical AI studies, the teaching of critical AI literacy, and herself an educator with hands-on knowledge of education as a domain, is that it is relatively decentralized. There's a lot of people who want to have, and to some degree are accustomed to having a certain amount of decision-making power. And they want to have a say. And that includes not only teachers, but students who as we've heard again and again, and parents for that matter. As we've heard again and again today, students are not necessarily buying in. They are suspicious. They don't like surveillance. They don't, they're not necessarily in any way prone to believing that everything a tech company does is for them. They kind of know better than that. And so I think as we think about, things that we could do, here's where the diluted part may be. It strikes me that what all of us seem to need is something like Google Docs, which means a platform that that students and professors can use to share information and share exchange files without having to print everything out. That will not be the site of either surveillance or some kind of big button that promises to generate everything right away. This is not an especially hard technology to build. And it's not even an expensive technology to build, in the sense that really as recently as maybe 10 years ago, maybe even less for some institutions, universities and colleges had their own servers with their own email tools and all kinds of things. So even as a kind of a public service kind of thing, or as a consortium, universities and colleges and K through 12 could get together for a platform that is controlled in the public interest, that would not be surveilling students, would not be selling their data, and would not be offering them text generation. I mean, that just seems to me like one of many things that could be done from the grassroots. And I wonder what both of you think.
I'm sure, Katie, you have so many thoughts. I have a quick point, so maybe I can just make it and make space, which is just to say I am like really like I would just agree with you. I'm heartened to hear it, because I think that just listening to the conversation today, it sounds like this is like a really fertile space for a policy win. And for someone in the chat, I may get this name wrong, but just the idea that it's also, we're potentially seeing the resurgence of labor organizing as well, which makes it a kind of important site for power. So I agree there. I just have one kind of caveat in terms of like when we're looking for these like model wins and what they look like. And that's based on the kind of last 5 years of AI discrimination policy, is that we want to be, when we put forward these models, I think the most powerful form of a win right now is a bright line, or what we call like a red line rule, saying we will not have the use of this technology used here. And obviously there can be other forms of wins, like Katie spoke about the kind of various procedural mechanisms that kind of enhance what I would call like due process, or kind of these like procedural transparency focused mechanisms, which are also very powerful. But we've seen the ways in which those audit-focused and kind of procedural mechanisms also in this particular moment can very quickly get co-opted by industry, who can be like, actually, we will tell you how to audit these systems and what that notice should look like. And okay, we're done with AI watermarking and like the job is done. And so if there's like speaking of like strategic messages that need to go out, I would say the most powerful one, similar to facial recognition, for example, just being banned in the state of New York based on parent advocacy, by the way, because they were sort of like suspicious and like, why are we spending money on this? Are, I think, the examples that like help set, like really, I think, like provide that optimism and that sense of like none of this is inevitable and like we get to decide much more effectively than the procedural transparency focused interventions.
Thank you. Katie, a final word as we wrap up?
I don't want the final word. I think Amba's final words were really important. I think I think we, yeah, I don't think I can add anything to that isn't that's any stronger than what Amba ended with, and I think it's also a really encouraging place to end. As we continue to be part, all at this table together.
Wonderful, thank you. So I will end just by thanking the whole Critical AI team for this incredible day and what I think we all hope is not the end of the conversation, but the start of many more conversations beginning in a few minutes in breakout rooms. So thanks to both Amba and Katie for your wonderful talks.
And thank you, Jane, for your excellent moderation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jane, Lauren, Katie. Great to be here. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. This was really wonderful, and I'm looking forward to seeing everybody in the breakouts who can. And for those who are joining us now, you will be able to have access to the links and the recordings later.
Yes, and lots of people have been asking if we are going to make these sessions available, the recordings of them. Absolutely, we will. Some presenters will provide their slides, some won't, but the recordings will definitely be there. And yes, the chat will be saved and shared. Thank you for that question, Alex Freemark. And thank you again, audience. You've been amazing. Thank you, moderators. Thank you, panelists. This has been really tremendously wonderful. Thank you, tech team. The tech team behind the scenes, Kelsey Keys, Diana Molina, Jayant Bandhu have been there since practically the crack of dawn. Thank you so much. I could not thank you enough. And everybody, I'm probably forgetting other people I should thank, but please forgive me. And see you, we're going to take a short break, and then we're going to reconvene in the breakouts. Thanks for that, Kelsey.